Installment of our Giants of Church History series. So tonight we're going to spend a little time with one of the most widely read Christian authors of all time, Clive Staples Lewis, better known as C.S. Lewis. And he was born in 1898 in Belfast, Ireland, to a family that really encouraged academic pursuits. They were a very academic family. Lewis describes growing up being surrounded by books stacked on the nightstand, books stacked in the kitchen, just books everywhere, and they were all available to him. And frankly, it sounds like paradise. And all these books around, and he growing up in Northern Ireland, which is very rainy, so lots of days where he was kind of forced to stay indoors, so he just grew up reading. He was a voracious reader. The whole family was reading. But this bookish paradise started to get some disruptions as he got a little older. In 1905, when he was 7, his brother was sent off to a boarding school in England, and so Lewis was left with no one his own age to play with, so he started to become a little bit more withdrawn, spending time reading even more. He also began at that point to start writing. He started writing poems and little short stories. And then 3 years later, in 1908, Lewis's mother died of cancer, and his father never really recovered from that. And so the home that had once been so warm now became a very cold and lonely place for Lewis. He became even more of a recluse than before, and the sorrow of his mother's death, plus a lot of the books that he'd been reading, some of the instruction he'd been getting, it all convinced him that God was either cruel or did not exist. And so he became an atheist in his early teens. Eventually, in 1917, Lewis went off to college at Oxford. And at that, he basically never really left Oxford. There was a very short stint where he served in the army during World War I, but otherwise, he lived for the rest of his life in the town of Oxford and around the school. Even towards the end of his life, when he got a professorship at Cambridge, he would make the trip home every weekend because he just loved Oxford so much, loved the people, loved the places. So he got there and he never left. Now, while at Oxford, after returning from his tour of duty in World War I, Lewis began to publish some poetry under a pseudonym, just stuff that didn't really ever garnish much acclaim or anything like that. He continued to study literature and the English language and to teach. And during that time, he was drawn to the works of two great writers from the 19th century, named George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton. These men were not only incredible writers, but also Christians. And their writings began to break down some of the intellectual walls that Lewis had built up against God. And while he was reading these Christian authors, he was also getting closer to a number of other younger writers and academics at Oxford, including J.R.R. Tolkien, who would eventually write The Lord of the Rings. A lot of these guys were also Christians. And so they began to work on Lewis as well. And eventually in 1929, after about 10 years of having these conversations with these guys and reading these books and all these Christian authors and realizing that his intellectual reasons for not being a Christian, for holding to atheism, were being broken down, in 1929, his opposition to God finally fell away. He became, first he became a theist. He was willing to admit that a God existed, but not necessarily embrace Christianity. It took another 2 years for him to officially convert to Christianity. But after that, the road was open for C.S. Lewis to become one of the greatest Christian writers of the 20th, or frankly, any century. I'm just curious, there aren't a ton of us tonight, but just by a show of hands, how many in this room have read something by C.S. Lewis before? 5 of 7. That's pretty good. For some people, they know C.S. Lewis maybe as the author of the great children's series, Chronicles of Narnia. For some people, they know him from sort of his adult Christian fiction, like Screwtape Letters or The Great Divorce. For other people, some people were introduced to the faith through Mere Christianity, which is one of the great sort of apologetics works and books that introduces people to what is the Christian faith and why you should be a Christian. And those are just some of the books. Starting in 1933 until his death in 1963, 30 years later, Lewis wrote at least 25 different books that could widely be considered Christian. in their nature. And a lot of them are considered modern classics. Because one of Lewis's great strengths is that he was a writer as well as a Christian, as opposed to just a Christian writer. There's a lot of people, including people who I love, whose books mean a lot to me, who are Christians, theologians first, and they are writers a distant second at best. Lewis is not that. More than many other books that I've talked about in this series or any other time you've heard me talk about it, Lewis's works they're not just easy to read, but they're a joy to read if you like the English language. His love for good writing, for English, is just as apparent as his love for God in his books. So they are a nice entry, if you're looking for a place to get started with Christian literature. One of the reasons he's so widely read is that his books are just well written. They're really nice. Now, Lewis is a bit unique in our church history series that we've been doing this year because his spirituality is a bit more intellectual, right? His walk away from faith was originally based on trauma, but it also was an intellectual decision that he didn't believe that God existed. And his return to faith was very much an intellectual thing. It was sort of the breaking down of all the intellectual arguments he'd built against the existence of God. Bernard and Teresa and John, who we've talked about in this series, they were focused more on the mystical, sort of experiential path to God. Richard Allen was more of brought the sort of the Methodist sense of spiritual willpower and work ethic and endurance. But Lewis's faith can seem to be a bit more from the head than the heart at times, even when you're reading his books. And he acknowledged that himself. He wrote, "The intellectual life is not the only road to God, nor the safest, but we find it to be a road, and it may be the one appointed for us." So Lewis's life and conversion to Christianity may have been more intellectual, but his writings have influenced millions of people to give Christianity or even just the concept of God a second chance. Now, the lesson I want to draw from Lewis's life is actually one that I hope we can apply to this whole Giants of Church History series. Because it took a whole cloud of witnesses to bring Lewis back to faith in God. A faith that had been deeply shaken or broken up by the pain and the loss, but then by all those intellectual arguments. Despite Lewis's rejection of Christianity, his interactions with other Christians around him, along with Christians from before his time, like MacDonald and Chesterton, they slowly brought him back to his belief in God and eventually his faith in Christianity. It took the witness of a lot of Christians, not just one or two, and not just over a few months, but years, to break through those defenses that he'd built up against God. And I think that should give us some encouragement as we relate to a world that doesn't know God. It's not all up to us individually. It's not all up to you, any of you, or me individually. We do have a responsibility to represent our faith well, to share explicitly with people who maybe are ready to hear us, or less explicitly through our life and the way that we go about our lives. But for a lot of people, it's going to be a process of years and many people to help them get to know God. So all we're asked to do is to play our small part in that by living our lives for Jesus and doing our best to love other people the way that God does. And hopefully that will just be one part of, like Lewis, having those sort of barriers against God broken down. At the same time, I think our faith can be strengthened by that cloud of witnesses as well. There's a lot of modern Christians, and even just spiritual people who wouldn't consider themselves Christian, who tend to focus on the experiential side of faith, right? Your experience of God is the thing that matters most. For a lot of people, right, their faith is about, it's me and Jesus, or it's me and God, and so all the other stuff, church, theology, organized religion, church history, the Bible, or other religious literature or texts, those are all seen often as secondary to the experience of God, individual experience of God. And Lewis addresses this too in Mere Christianity. So I'm going to quote kind of at length here. This is a longer quote. So Lewis writes, "I remember once when I had been giving a talk to the RF. An old, hard-bitten officer got up and said, "I've no use for all that stuff, but mind you, I'm a religious man too. I know there's a God. I felt him, out alone in the desert at night, the tremendous mystery. And that's just why I don't believe in all your neat little dogmas and formulas about him. To anyone who's met the real thing, they all seem so petty and pedantic and unreal." Lewis continues, "In a sense, I quite agreed with that man. I think he had probably had a real experience of God in the desert. And when he turned from that experience to the Christian creeds, I think he really was turning from something real to something less real. In the same way, if a man has once looked at the Atlantic Ocean from the beach, and then goes and looks at a map of the Atlantic, he also will be turning from something real to something less real, turning from waves to a bit of colored paper. But here comes the point. The map is admittedly only colored paper, but there are two things you have to remember about it. In the first place, it's based on what hundreds and thousands of people have found out by sailing the real Atlantic. In that way, it has behind it masses of experience, just as real as the one you could have from the beach. Only, while yours would be a single glimpse, the map fits all those different experiences together. In the second place, if you want to go anywhere, the map is absolutely necessary. As long as you're content with walks on the beach, your own glimpses are far more fun than looking at a map. But the map is going to be more use than walks on the beach if you want to get to America. Now, this section, this passage I just read from Mere Christianity, he's introducing why he's going to talk about theology. But I think it applies to church history just as well. And that is, our experience is just one experience of God. But the reason to learn church history, or theology as Lewis is talking about, and the reason I've been sharing about sort of the lives of great figures from church history across the ages, is because their experiences and wisdom help to fill out our map. Over the course of just the last few weeks of this series, we've met people from France 1,000 years ago, Spain 500 years ago, America during its infancy, and an Englishman from the 20th century tonight. If you go back and listen to the ones I've done in the church history series a few years ago, we could add people from Germany and North Africa and Italy, and we could go from the 5th century AD to World War II. This experience, these people, they lived incredibly different lives. Their experience of the world was vastly different from ours and often from each other's. I mean, we're talking about thousands of years of history, people living in vast different parts of the globe. And yet each one of them experienced the same God, profoundly reshaping their lives. Even though they wrote about God differently or behaved differently after their encounter with God, each of them was inspired by the one God that we all worship. The reason we look at these giants of church history is not just because history is interesting, even though I think it is, or because we think that these people should be worshipped or anything like that. It's because there are 2,000 years worth of Christians who have come before us, and their experience of God gives us a detailed map, helping us to draw closer to the one that we worship. So whether we're talking about Bernard of Clairvaux's 4 stages of loving God, or Teresa of Avila's interior castle, Christians throughout the ages have given us a map towards a deep spiritual union with God. Or we can talk about how John of the Cross endured suffering and chose to experience suffering. Or how Richard Allen endured and overcame persecution and injustice and bias. And in both of those things, we can see a map towards a lifestyle that glorifies God and tries to live the way that Jesus lived. Deep thinkers like C.S. Lewis can reshape our view of God or how we relate to God and set us on new paths within the map. So as we close this year's installment of Giants of Church History, I hope that it inspires you to explore more of the history of our faith. It's a really imperfect history full of very imperfect people. Some moments are worth celebrating, like Dr. King's civil rights movement, and others are painful and sinful, like the Crusades. But within that messy history, we can step outside of just our individual experience of God and meet the experience of millenniums worth of believers. Christians from the time of Jesus to the present day can help us know and love God ever more deeply. So may we open ourselves up to know God in that deep way, not only through our own experience, but through the experience and the wisdom of countless people who have loved God deeply throughout the ages. Let's spend some time gathered in prayer together.